Okay, so the next thing we're going to cover is scatterplots and creating a scatterplot in Ggplot. And so we're going to do two types, a simple scatterplot, which involves two continuous variables, and a grouped scatterplot, which is two continuous variables and a categorical variable. So this is where you could split your scatterplot on gender or your experimental group, something like that. Alright, so I'm going to load some data from the field book, the anxiety and exam performance data. So you had 103 students, and we looked at the time they spent revising, their exam performance, exam anxiety, and gender. So we're going to load that exam anxiety data set, and then deal with the fact that some of this didn't load necessarily the best way. So let's start by making this a little bigger. There we go. By loading that data set. So I've got my scatter plot here. And so I'm going to have my exam data is, I'm going to go back up here and rerun my working directory so I can find that data. So that data set for me is saved as chapter 4, exam anxiety, SV, header, oops. If I can type, there we go. All right, so we have this exam data set loaded, and it has a participant number, how long they spent revising, the exam score, anxiety. So all of those should be integers. But here, gender loaded as an integer instead of a factor variable. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure our factor variables are actually factors, because when I go to make that grouped scatter plot, if it's not a factor variable, it would be very unhappy with us. So we're going to change that gender variable to a factor using the factor function that was talked about in one of the previous videos. And so I'm going to type that out over here. So I'm going to change my exam variable. I specifically want to change gender to be factored. So the first thing you list under factor is the column you want to factor. The next thing I want to list is the levels. So my levels are going to be 1 and 2. And then I want to label those levels. So make them male and female. That you would have to know who you coded as 1 and 2. And so males are 1 and females are 2 in this example. Now you'll see over here under gender, it's a factored variable. See how it says factor right here. I could also look at a table of that gender variable and see that it's listed as male and female. So now I have labels, which are really great. If you capitalize your labels and make them proper case, that will make your life a lot easier when you go to make the graph, because then you don't have to change the labels. Alright, so let's make a scatter plot. So I'm going to start by typing in scatter plot. I'm going to use the Ggplot. So this is where I'm creating my empty plot. So remember, the first thing you have to do is create a blank space for your plot. So you list the data set, so it's exam, the aesthetics, AES for aesthetics, and then your two continuous variables. So scatter plots need to have two continuous variables listed here. And then remember, it's x comma y, so whichever one you want on your x-axis first. So I'm going to do anxiety, spelled correctly, and then their exam score. So how anxious they are correlated with work regression, their exam score. So I want to know if more anxious people score lower on the exam. So you have to remember to load the library since I'm doing this video at a separate time. There we go. So now I've got my blank scatter plot made. Okay, so there are no layers in the plot, so we have to add some layers. Well, how do we do that? So let's go back to my notes here. So I created my scatter plot. Now we're going to add some layers. So the GM point function. So GM_point adds a set of dots to the graph. So point means scatter plot essentially. And then what I want to do is add X and Y labels. And that was in the previous video talking about that functionality. And so you should watch the histogram video first. So let's do scatter plots. So I'm going to take my scatter plot and add a layer. You don't have to hit enter between these. I'm just doing it so you can see. So I'm adding a new layer to that scatter plot. And that layer is going to be GM_point. And let's just look at those two together. So now I have a scatter plot built out here. It's pretty ugly, but it's, that's the easiest, quickest way to make a scatter plot. Let's make it prettier. So let's add X labels. So let's go anxiety score, and then a Y label, exam score. So let's see what that does to the graph. So now my graph has better X and Y labels. Now I could, at this point, go in and clean up the graph. So in the last video I talked about theme_black-white. That's a pretty good way to clean up a graph. Let me run that one. Okay, so that's a fairly nice looking graph, but it's still got those grid lines, kind of faint, but you can see them. So if I really wanted to clean this up, I could use the theme coding that I talked about in the histogram video. So let me scroll up and show it to you. So what I did was I called this whole thing cleanup. And it is a set of theme codes for Ggplot that allows you to clean up the graph. And so let me run that. It's not going to do anything. I'm just saving cleanup as these options. But panel grid major, it's going to turn off the major panel lines. It's element blank here. Panel grid minor, it's going to turn off the minor grid lines. Panel background is going to turn off the gray background. So element blank means turn that off. And then axis line here is going to add X and Y axis lines. So add a line and make it black. So what I'm going to do down here, since I saved it as cleanup, is just add cleanup to it. Well, let's run that. And now that is a very pretty graph. And so you'll want to look at how graphs are formatted in your own field, but that is a great way to do a quick cleanup of graph, or theme_BW. Which makes it automatically black and white. So that's my simple scatter plot. Pretty easy. What about a grouped scatter plot? Okay, so here's a simple scatter plot. Here's my talking about the background. Talked about this in the previous video. But basically this turns off all the grid lines and then adds 2 axis lines for you. So here's our cleaned up scatter plot. Now let's try adding a regression line to the scatter plot. And so we're going to take that same scatter plot and just change it a little bit. So regression lines are under GM_smooth here. And so that's not quite mnemonic until you realize that it's a smoothing function. So if I just do GM_smooth, what's going to happen? So let's try that. Oop, wrong one. So this is a scatter plot with no line. I'm going to try adding now the GM_smooth function. So let's see what that does without any options in it. So same scatter plot with one more line. And so it adds a more than likely what's called a lowest function. Here we go, down here. Which is essentially a roving average. It's not quite perfect, but it gives you the regression line given the dots around it. So it is going to be a non-linear trend if you just do GM_smooth. So if I wanted a linear regression line, what I would do is in the parentheses for GM_smooth, add method equals, and for linear lines it's LM for linear model. It's method equals LM will add a straight line. So let's try running that code. So now I have a linear model, so a straight line relationship between exam scores and anxiety scores. more than likely it's actually curvilinear, but you can play with the method function to change how it draws the line for you. If you wanted to change the color of this line here, what you can do is add the color function right here. So I could do red or black or gray or purple or green or pink. Pick anything. Okay. And so that gave me a black regression line. So what is this gray space around the regression line? Why is that automatically there? Well, I'm assuming it's the 95% confidence interval. So I think GM Smooth automatically adds a confidence interval around the regression line. And so you can actually change that by looking at alpha. So remember, alpha is our type 1 error, so it's the opposite of confidence interval. So if you have a 0.05 alpha, you're getting a 95% confidence interval. And so we can change how that confidence band looks. So let's try making it something crazy. Normally it's 0.05, that's probably the default. Well, let's try 0.15. And so that'll give us an 85% confidence interval. Okay. And so it's going to be much smaller. Like, we may not even be able to see it. So let's try 0.05, see if we get it back. Oh, well, putting in alpha apparently made it go away. You should be able to change alpha, as evidenced by the help function here. Part of it says alpha. So I'm not entirely sure. Oh, we have to do it in aesthetics. Good gracious. That's why it doesn't like it. Let's try that. There we go. Okay, so that gives us a 0.05 one. Let's make it bigger. So bigger confidence intervals should give us a smaller range. Okay, so it's part of the aesthetics function within GN Smooth. So aesthetics can be used in a bunch of different places. But generally we want to leave that alone since most of psych goes with a 95% confidence interval. But that's what that band is around it. And so you'll notice it's much wider down here at the bottom because there aren't that many dots to estimate from. And it gets much smaller down here because I have more dots to estimate from. So confidence intervals tend to get smaller with larger sample sizes. All right, so that's how you add a regression line to your plot. What I can also do is make a group scatter plot. Okay, so let's try adding in the group function. So I want to create a new scatter plot this time. Okay, so this is a grouped scatter plot. And then this is a simple scatter plot. And this one is no line. Alright, so to create that group scatter plot, I first have to make myself a blank graph. So my Ggplot, I'm going to use my exam code. For my aesthetics, I'm going to use the same one, so anxiety and exam, but now I have one more. And what I'm going to add is color equals gender. Okay. So remember that the color function tends to be used with dots and lines. The fill function tends to be used with bar graphs. But you can always try playing with it too and seeing which one you like better. Okay. So that gives me my blank scatter plot. Okay, so no layers in the plot yet. Let's add some layers to it. So scatter2 plus, let's make it a geom point. And so let's see what that does. So this is create me a scatter plot. So it automatically give me, excuse me, created me a scatter plot with green and red dots that are separated by gender. So that's nice. If we wanted to add the regression lines to that. I could do that same GM smooth function. So let's say that the method is lm. And then with that, I have to tell it how to fill. So if I just do this, it's going to give me the two different scatter plot lines. And it gives me their confidence bands. But because this is overlapping, which is, it's pretty readable right now, I could change within GM Smooth and get it to color by gender. So it doesn't color at the moment, it just creates you separate lines. So the way that you do that is the aesthetics function, fill equals gender. Okay, so what is the difference here between color and fill? Color is creating me the separate lines. Fill is going to color in these confidence bands by that categorical variable. Okay, so now the lines or the confidence bands are also colored. Okay, so color, like I said, tends to be used for dots and lines. Fill tends to be used when you have a space that you want to color in a whole section, bars, and in this case, confidence bands. So the aesthetics function up here is color, separate them by the dots and the lines by gender. Here it's fill in that by gender. All right, so let's add some X and Y axis labels. So the same ones as before, anxiety score plus exam score. Now it's very tempting to just run this line here, but it doesn't know these two lines, and it's like, I don't know what to do. So anytime you add something to your graph, you do have to run the entire block of code again. So now I have my anxiety score and my exam score X and Y axis labels that are nicely labeled. I could also add my theme coding. It's my cleanup code that I've been using for a while. Okay, so that cleaned up my graph pretty nice. And this will be a perfectly usable graph, but let's talk about how to control more of the functionality of this graph. And this is true for the other scatter plots as well. I'm just showing you one of the more complicated ones. So let's say I want to change the colors of my men and women confidence bands because I need it to be black and white, and I want to change the name of the labels and also the name of the legend title. So let's say we just want to like play with all the options here. So what we're going to use is scale, fill, mangle. So there are a bunch of different scale filling options, but we're gonna work with mangle here, and it's kind of got three different parts. It's got the name function, where you can give it a name of the legend title, basically is what it is. It's got labels, and so the labels are what are the groups, and then it has to have values. So values are what are the colors you want to use. So first here, let's name it gender of participant. The labels here, we could leave them as men and women, so I could leave that out completely. And let's do the first try without it. But you have to have values to make scale, fill, mangle work. So let's do black and gray. So let's try running that. So notice it did something interesting. What it did was it filled in the fill. So I used scale fill here. And so that changed the fill piece here. So it changed the color of the confidence band because that's what's being filled. So keeping understanding how that matches across code is important. And then what it did was it actually just gave me an extra legend with the fill piece because that's the only part I've changed. Let's also add in labels, so I can show you how labels works. So let's say we wanted instead for it to be men and women. Got some picky reviewer who wanted it to be men and women and not male and female. So what that's going to do is change this down here to men and women. But now I've got two different legends, and that's just silly because it really should be the same set of legends. So what can I do? Well, now that's where scale color manual comes into play. So I changed the color up here and the fill because this is a grouped plot. So now I'm going to change the fill and the color down here. You can actually use the exact same code. You probably want to, or it's going to separate out the graphs. When you have the exact same code in there, it's going to go, oh, you want to do the same thing twice. So now our scatter plot's looking pretty complex, but we're really just tweaking every little last bit. And so now you'll notice that the colors have all changed to black and white, or black and gray, and now you might try variations on a theme for gray here to make it more readable. But what I also could do is make it black and purple. Like I can get very specific on my coloring to make it stand out, where the fill is one color but the line is another. And that'll allow you to tweak every single part of the graph using the manual function, the labels, the axis title, and the coloring. So all that together is scatterplots, a simple scatterplot with a regression line, and a group scatterplot, and how you can tweak the values of the legends and the legend titles on those scatterplots.